The morning light of Cedar Hill always came softly, spreading gold over the rows of modest houses that lined the street where Sam Thornton's auto shop stood. Each day began the same way, the creak of the metal shutter, the smell of oil and steel, the faint hum of country radio playing from an old speaker mounted on the wall. Sam moved through the space like a man who'd learned peace through repetition. His hands were large, calloused but steady. To those who knew him, there was something sacred in the way he worked, a quiet ritual of patience, effort, and grace. The town respected him. He was the man who never charged more than he had to, who sometimes fixed cars for free when he knew a customer was struggling. Children waved when they passed his shop, older folks greeted him by name. In a world loud with ambition and deceit, Sam's steadiness made him rare, and in that rarity there was beauty. At home, the walls told another story. The small two-story house he shared with his wife, Vivian, and her daughter, Avery, was neat and tastefully kept, but it carried an unease that only silence could reveal. Vivian moved through rooms like a woman forever measuring her life against someone else's reflection. She was elegant, always immaculate, but her eyes were restless, scanning for something that wasn't there. Her laughter, once free and musical, now carried a faint sharpness, like a note slightly off-key. Avery, 24 and radiant, had inherited her mother's poise but not her father's patience. She lived as if the world owed her comfort. Her conversations were filled with names of people who owned more, dressed better, traveled farther. She loved Sam, or at least the version of him that made life easy, the provider, the quiet man who paid the bills and never raised his voice. But she didn't understand him. Few did. Sam's evenings were his sanctuary. After dinner, he often sat outside on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Sometimes he'd hear laughter from inside, Vivian talking on the phone, Avery showing off new clothes. He would smile faintly, but the sound didn't reach him anymore. He was proud of his family, but something had shifted over time. Love had become polite. Gratitude had become performance. He often thought about how he'd gotten here, the long years of saving, of working in the Texas heat to build something solid. When he married Vivian, he believed he was building a forever. She had come into his life after his first wife's death, a burst of color in the grayness of grief. Her charm, her elegance, her ambition, they had pulled him back into the world. For a while it felt like redemption. But dreams, he'd learned, have quiet expiration dates. Now he watched her lean more and more toward her old friends, the ones who lived for high society charity galas and champagne brunches. She smiled differently with them, brighter, rehearsed. He'd hear her speak of trips and parties, names of people she used to know in Dallas before she married the mechanic. She never said it cruelly, but it lingered like a truth neither dared admit. Vivian missed a life he could never give her. At work, Sam's peace remained untouched. The shop was his chapel, his confession booth, his place of order in a world that no longer made sense. He found meaning in the way machines told the truth. A car would never lie about what was wrong. It wouldn't pretend to be fine when something deep inside was breaking. He wished people were built that way, with clear signals, a noise, a warning light before the failure. But people he knew often broke in silence. He began to notice Vivian's distance in subtle things, the way she avoided his gaze at breakfast, the sudden late-night texts she said were from friends, the absence of warmth in her touch. He wanted to believe it was stress, not discontent. So he worked harder, brought home flowers, paid for Avery's wedding expenses without hesitation. Love, he believed, was about endurance. You stayed, you gave, you forgave. And yet, there were moments when even his faith wavered. Nights when he sat alone in the dim kitchen, her laughter echoing faintly from the upstairs bedroom as she scrolled through her phone, her smile lit by a screen. He would look at her framed photo on the counter, her wedding day smile bright and full of promise, and wonder if love ever truly dies or if it just evolves into something you can no longer recognize. Still, every morning, he rose before dawn and put on his work shirt, carrying the dignity of a man who refused to break. To the world, Sam Thornton was content, a pillar, a good man, a quiet man. But inside, a storm was forming. Not loud or violent, but slow and heavy, like thunder that takes its time crossing the sky. He didn't yet know it, but that silence, the one he'd mistaken for peace, was becoming the sound of everything he had slipping away. Sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with words, it starts with silence. Have you ever felt someone slowly pulling away while pretending everything was fine? Tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and have you ever seen love fade quietly like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading every one of them. The shift began with laughter, not the kind that filled the house with warmth, but the kind that echoed faintly from behind closed doors, filtered through phone screens and social calls that didn't include Sam. Vivian had started hosting again. Small gatherings at first, just old friends from her Dallas days, women whose perfume carried the faint memory of luxury. They were polished, loud, and effortlessly shallow, and their presence filled the house with a new kind of noise, one that made Sam feel like a visitor in his own home. To the world, Vivian was radiant again. Her eyes sparkled in photos, her voice lighter when she spoke of new charity events, bridal plans, and luncheons. To Sam she seemed happy, but it was the fragile happiness of someone playing a role they had missed for too long. He told himself he was glad for her, that everyone deserved a little lightness. But deep down he recognized the danger in that light. It was the kind that blinds before it burns. Avery's engagement only intensified the transformation. Her fiancé, Marcus Langford, was the son of a well-known Dallas pastor, a family draped in wealth, reputation, and the kind of social status Vivian once worshipped. The announcement spread through the community like a spark. Vivian's face lit up when she spoke of it. She was finally part of something big again, something the world would applaud. The wedding became her obsession. The gowns, the venue, the guest list, every detail reflecting not love but validation. Sam watched from the sidelines, quiet as always. He attended meetings, paid deposits, nodded when Vivian spoke about expectations and standards. His voice rarely entered those conversations anymore. It was as if his opinion had become an accessory, optional, decorative. Still, he didn't protest. He believed love meant trust even when it hurt to offer it. In the evenings he'd stay late at the shop, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening, cleaning tools already clean. He wasn't avoiding home, at least that's what he told himself. The truth was gentler and sadder. He simply didn't recognize home anymore. The air felt curated like a showroom, every cushion fluffed, every scent planned. Vivian's laughter grew thinner, more performative. Avery barely acknowledged him now except when she needed something signed, approved, or paid for. When Vivian's old friends visited, Sam noticed how they looked at him, polite smiles hiding quiet judgment. They saw a man of labor, not legacy. A husband too plain for the woman beside him. Vivian never corrected them. If anything, she seemed to shrink from him when they were around, subtly distancing herself, like she didn't want to be mistaken for someone ordinary. It was in those moments Sam felt the first ache of true loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from realizing the people you love most have outgrown the version of you they once needed. He didn't resent her for it. He only felt tired, a soul kind of tired. He wanted to reach out, to remind her of who they were, of the quiet nights when laughter was real, when they danced barefoot in the kitchen and promised never to let the world in. But words felt futile now. He started noticing little changes. Vivian's wardrobe shifting to designer labels again, Avery's tone growing sharper, more entitled. Their conversations revolved around things he couldn't touch. Floral arrangements, diamond settings, honeymoon destinations. He became a background sound in his own story, a gentle hum they didn't notice anymore. Sometimes he'd stand outside the living room door, listening to Vivian speak about the upcoming wedding. Her voice carried excitement, but underneath, there was desperation, the need to prove something, to rewrite her life's image. She spoke of it as if it would redeem her years of compromise, as if Avery's perfect wedding would erase every trace of struggle. Sam didn't argue when she spent lavishly. He told himself it was worth it, that seeing her happy, even superficially, was better than watching her fade. He'd always believed in second chances, even when the math didn't add up. But late at night, as he sat at the edge of the bed while Vivian scrolled through photos of dresses and decor, he wondered whether love could truly anchor someone who was determined to drift. He thought often about storms, how some men try to build walls to keep them out, while others stand still hoping they'll pass. Sam was the latter. He stayed still, patient, faithful, believing that if he loved long enough, deeply enough, she would remember what they once had. He couldn't see that the tide had already taken her. And yet, he never lost his gentleness. Even when she began calling him Sam instead of honey. Even when her gaze drifted over him like he was furniture. He still made her coffee in the morning, still left a note on the counter if he had to leave early. He loved quietly even as the house grew louder with everything except love. In the stillness of those nights, Sam began to understand something painful, that sometimes, love isn't lost in betrayal or violence, but in the slow erosion of attention. It slips away quietly while both hearts pretend they're still holding on. The morning had started like any other, sunlight spilling through the dusty windows of Thornton Auto Repair, the rhythmic whine of wrenches, the smell of oil and steel thick in the air. Sam moved slowly that day, slower than usual. The Texas heat pressed down heavy, and though his face was calm, There was a shadow beneath his skin, the fatigue he'd been ignoring for weeks. He'd been pushing himself harder lately, taking on more work, staying later, trying to keep up with the mounting expenses of Avery's wedding. Every invoice, every transaction felt like another piece of himself being spent. But Sam never complained. He believed that love meant sacrifice, that if a man could provide, he should. Around noon he wiped the sweat from his brow and stood to stretch. The world tilted slightly just for a moment. He thought it was the heat. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and went back to work under the hood of an old Chevy pickup. That's when the pain hit, sharp, unrelenting, spreading across his chest like fire. His wrench clattered to the ground. The world went silent. Sam staggered backward, gasping for air, his hand clutching his shirt. The shop lights blurred, his vision narrowing into a tunnel of light and noise. He tried to call out, but his voice broke into a whisper. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. The echo of his fall was sharp, final, swallowed by the hum of an engine still idling nearby. Minutes passed before Darius, his young apprentice, noticed. The boy had stepped out to take a phone call, then returned to find his mentor motionless on the ground. Panic surged through him as he dropped to his knees, shouting for help, fumbling for his phone. His hands trembled as he pressed down on Sam's chest, counting beats, praying between gasps. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, though it felt like hours. When Sam opened his eyes again, everything was white and still. The sterile light of the hospital ceiling glared above him, machines whispering softly in the background. Tubes ran from his arm, his heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound anchoring him to the fragile thread between life and loss. He didn't know how long he'd been out, only that his body felt foreign, heavy, restrained, tired in a way no rest could fix. In the hallway Vivian stood in silence. The doctor's words came calm but cold. The surgery was urgent, the cost unavoidable, $50,000 if he wanted a chance to recover fully. Vivian's face tightened as she nodded mechanically, her mind already elsewhere. $50,000. The same amount she had just paid as a deposit for the ballroom Avery insisted on. Her thoughts moved in flashes. The guest list, the photographers, the expectations. The wedding was only months away and everyone already knew the venue. Canceling it would invite questions, whispers, humiliation. She could hear them already. She couldn't even afford her daughter's wedding. The doctor waited for an answer. Vivian asked for time. She walked outside to the parking lot, the heat hitting her like a wall. Her pulse raced, her breath shallow. She leaned against her car, staring into the distance. She told herself Sam was strong, he always had been. Maybe the doctors were exaggerating. Maybe he'd recover with rest. Her heart whispered guilt, but pride shouted louder. Inside, Sam drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind flickering with images. The shop, the laughter of his workers, Vivian's face on their wedding day. He had always believed love was eternal. Now, lying there with machines breathing for him, he wondered if that belief had made him blind. By evening, Vivian had made her decision. The hospital called again, asking for payment to proceed. She didn't answer. Instead, she sat at the dining table at home, surrounded by fabric samples and wedding magazines, her phone face down beside a half-finished glass of wine. The silence pressed in, thick and accusing. She tried to justify it, told herself she couldn't ruin Avery's dream, not after all they'd planned. Sam would understand, wouldn't he? He always did. Somewhere across town, Darius sat in the hospital lobby, waiting, hoping someone would come for the man who'd once taught him everything. Nurses passed by, their expressions professional but weary. Time crawled. The surgery never happened that night. Sam's body fought on its own, trembling against the weight of exhaustion. When dawn broke, a nurse adjusted his blanket and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. She didn't know his story, but she saw the ring on his finger, worn and faded, a symbol that once meant forever. By morning, the doctor signed a note recommending immediate transfer to a charity hospital if family could not fund the procedure. A nurse made the call. Darius signed the forms. Outside, the sun rose over Cedar Hill, casting long shadows through the glass. And somewhere in that morning light, Sam's heart, battered, faithful and unprotected, kept beating, unaware that love had already chosen its price. Some betrayals don't come with shouting, they come with silence, hesitation, and a choice that says everything. If you were in Vivian's place, what would you have done? And if you were Sam, could you ever forgive? Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and share your truth in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear your story. The morning after Sam's release from the hospital was quiet, almost too quiet. The charity doctors had done what they could, patched him together, stabilized his heart, But the man who walked out of that building was not the same man who had gone in. His steps were slower, his shoulders slightly hunched, his skin pale beneath the soft Texas sun. Yet there was still dignity in his gait, the quiet strength of someone who refused to crumble completely. Vivian met him at home, her expression composed, her voice light as if nothing had happened. The house was spotless, candles burning, a faint scent of lilies in the air. On the dining table sat a folder of invoices, deposits, receipts, contracts, all for Avery's upcoming wedding. It was her new gospel, her redemption story. The day before she had moved their savings, everything they had built together over the years, into Avery's wedding account. It was a single transfer, clean and irreversible. Vivian had told herself it wasn't betrayal, it was timing. Sam would recover, she believed or wanted to believe, and somehow they would rebuild. The wedding couldn't wait. Reputation couldn't wait. Love, she told herself, could. Avery meanwhile glowed. She spent her days in bridal fittings, her laughter echoing through phone calls with bridesmaids, florists, and photographers. She spoke of centerpieces that cost more than a month's rent, of an orchestra flown in from Atlanta, of a gown worth more than her stepfather's entire medical bill. In her mind, the wedding was not just a celebration. It was a statement, a proof of status, a declaration that she belonged in the world her mother missed so deeply. Sam spent most of those days in his recliner, wrapped in a blanket, the television humming softly in the background. His chest still ached when he breathed too deeply, but he said nothing. He didn't ask about the bills. He didn't ask about the savings. The part of him that once demanded explanations had grown quiet. He only watched, the movements in the house, the light that never seemed to reach him anymore. At night, he'd hear the faint rustle of Vivian's laughter through the walls. She'd stay up late scrolling through bridal catalogs, murmuring names of designers and venues. The phone glowed against her face, painting her in blue light, a woman who still believed she could control how the world saw her. Sam's shop had been sold temporarily to cover his recovery time. The employees managed it, but he rarely visited now. His doctor advised rest, but rest, he discovered, was its own kind of punishment. With nothing to do but think, the silence became unbearable. Weeks passed, and the house transformed into a war room for glamour. Packages arrived daily, boxes of silk, imported shoes, invitations engraved in gold. Vivian moved through it all with purpose, orchestrating perfection. When neighbors asked about Sam, she spoke vaguely, saying he was taking some time off. She never mentioned the hospital. She never mentioned how close she'd come to losing him. Then came the wedding day, a grand affair held in one of Dallas's most prestigious venues. The hall was lit like a cathedral, golden chandeliers glimmering against polished marble floors. The orchestra played softly as guests arrived in designer suits and gowns. Cameras flashed. Smiles gleamed. Vivian stood at the center of it all, proud, radiant, dressed in silver and grace. Her daughter, her masterpiece, walked down the aisle in a gown that cost a small fortune, every bead shimmering like redemption. Sam wasn't there. He wasn't even invited. He sat instead in his small living room, wrapped in his old blanket, the hum of the oxygen machine steady beside him. The wedding streamed live on social media, and despite himself, he watched. The video buffered occasionally, but he caught glimpses, Vivian's polished smile, Avery's glowing face, the endless applause. The words, Mr. and Mrs. Langford, flashed on screen, and the crowd erupted in joy. Sam felt a strange calm. No anger, no shock, just a quiet understanding. He had given everything, his money, his body, his devotion. And in return he had been replaced by an image, one that sparkled brighter, smiled wider, and cared less. When the feed ended, he sat for a long time in silence. On the table beside him lay his hospital discharge papers, still unpaid. He folded them neatly, slid them into a drawer, and looked around the dimly lit room. The house felt smaller now, emptier. Even the walls seemed to breathe differently, as if they too had grown tired of pretending. Outside, fireworks erupted somewhere in the distance, the wedding celebration continuing under the Dallas night sky. The sound reached him faintly, like the echo of a world he no longer belonged to. Sam leaned back, his breath steady, his heart fragile but still beating. That night, for the first time in years, he prayed, not for love to return but for peace to come. The night before the surgery felt endless. The charity hospital was a world away from the sleek, white hallways of the private clinic Vivian once toured for her beauty treatments. Here, the walls were faded, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and uncertainty. Outside, the Texas rain fell in a steady whisper, washing the streets clean while Sam lay between consciousness and dreams, unaware of how close he had come to disappearing quietly from the world. It was his niece, Carla, who found him. She was a nurse's aide in a nearby facility, young but relentless, and when she heard through Darius that her uncle's surgery had been postponed for lack of payment, something in her broke. She made calls, begged administrators, and fought through layers of paperwork and policy. Her voice cracked, but her will didn't. By the time the charity board approved the emergency procedure, Sam's heartbeat had already begun to falter. The surgeons worked through the early hours of the morning, their faces drawn with fatigue but their hands steady. When it was over, they stepped back and exhaled. Against the odds, Sam lived. His heart, weakened and scarred, still found the strength to beat. When he woke days later, it was to a different kind of silence. No flowers, no cards, no familiar face waiting by his bedside. Just the sound of rain tapping against the window and the quiet hum of machines keeping time with his breath. His mind felt cloudy at first, a fog of medication and pain. But as awareness returned, so did the ache, not in his chest but somewhere deeper where love and disbelief coexist. Vivian hadn't come. Not once. Each time the nurse entered, Sam glanced up with quiet hope, expecting to see her shadow behind the door. But it never happened. Instead, it was Carla who arrived, tired, in her scrubs, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She brought soup, read him the local news, and prayed quietly when she thought he was asleep. To her, he was more than an uncle. He was the man who'd paid for her nursing school, who fixed her old car every time it stalled, who once told her that doing right would never make you poor. Now she saw the cost of that belief. Sam didn't speak much during recovery. His voice was faint, but his eyes carried the story. He watched the other patients, listened to the cries, the prayers, the laughter from visiting families. Life here was raw, honest, stripped of pretense. The nurses were kind, the doctors overworked, the hallways alive with the quiet pulse of survival. In that place, surrounded by strangers who had nothing yet gave everything, Sam began to see life differently. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ward in amber light, a nurse approached with a small white envelope. She said it had been left at the reception desk with his name on it. Sam's hand trembled as he opened it. Inside was a plain card, no handwriting except for 5 small words printed in the center. "You'll understand someday." No signature. But he knew. He stared at those words until the letters blurred. There was no anger in him, just a hollow kind of realization, that the woman he had once built his world around had chosen to step outside of it. The card wasn't an apology. It wasn't even guilt. It was distance, the final act of someone who had already moved on. Sam folded the card carefully and placed it on the nightstand beside his bed. He didn't throw it away. He just left it there, a symbol of everything he would no longer chase. In the days that followed, he began walking again. Slowly at first, his steps uncertain, his balance fragile. The nurses encouraged him, their smiles small but sincere. Carla visited each night, bringing news from the outside world. She never mentioned Vivian. Neither did he. When Sam was finally discharged, the staff gathered briefly to see him off. There were handshakes, blessings, and a few quiet tears. Darius was waiting by the door, holding the keys to Sam's pickup. Together, they drove in silence through the city, past the glowing billboards, past the restaurants where he once took Vivian on anniversaries, past the life that no longer belonged to him. By the time they reached Cedar Hill, the sun was setting. Sam looked out at the horizon, his heart heavy but alive. He wasn't sure what waited ahead, only that something inside him had hardened. Not in bitterness but in resolve. Love had failed him, faith had faltered, but life had chosen to keep him. And that, he decided, was enough reason to start again. Sometimes mercy comes from strangers while love turns its back. Have you ever been saved by someone who had no reason to care, while the ones who should have stood by you disappeared? Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever learned that blood or love doesn't always mean loyalty? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might find strength in your truth. When Sam stepped out of the hospital, the sunlight hit him like a question. It wasn't the light he remembered. This one felt colder, emptier, the kind that reveals more than it warms. Darius drove him back home in silence, each mile carrying the weight of something unsaid. The roads were familiar, but the feeling wasn't. Cedar Hill no longer felt like home. The small house at the corner of Elm Street stood quiet. Too quiet. The lawn was freshly cut, the porch swept. But the air held that uneasy stillness of a place that no longer belongs to you. Darius helped him to the door, but Sam raised a trembling hand, signaling he could manage from here. He wanted to face whatever waited inside alone. The moment he stepped through the door, the world shifted. Boxes lined the hallway. His work boots, his tools, even his framed photo from the shop's opening day, all packed neatly and stacked by the entryway. The living room that once carried laughter and music now felt staged, empty, as if no life had ever filled it. Vivian's perfume lingered faintly in the air, sweet but distant. The curtains were drawn wide, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor like a spotlight on absence. There was a note on the coffee table, short, impersonal, written on crisp stationery. The words didn't sting as much as the handwriting did. Vivian's elegant loops and curves, the same ones that once signed birthday cards and love letters, now spelled out detachment. She needed space. A softer word for abandonment. He walked through the house slowly, each room a ghost of what had been. The kitchen still had her favorite wine glasses on the counter. Their bed, now stripped bare, seemed smaller without her presence, colder without her scent. Even the framed picture of Avery's graduation was gone. Taken. As if he had never existed in that part of their story. Sam sat on the edge of the bed and closed his eyes. His chest ached, not from the scar, but from the emptiness that followed betrayal. He had given everything. His savings, his time, his pride, believing love was an anchor that could survive any storm. But he had been wrong. Love, he realized now, could drown a man just as easily. Outside, the world went on. Neighbors drove past, unaware that a chapter of quiet suffering was closing behind that door. Sam stood, picked up one of the boxes and carried it to his old pickup. He packed his life piece by piece, his tools, his overalls, a few worn shirts, the Bible his mother gave him before she died. That was all. No photos, no keepsakes, no reminders of what was lost. The for sale sign went up a week later. He didn't stay to see who bought the house. He didn't need to. The house wasn't his anymore, neither was the life that came with it. He sold the auto shop next. The same shop he had built with calloused hands and long nights, where every bolt and beam carried his sweat. When he handed the keys to the new owner, there was no ceremony, no goodbye, just a quiet nod. As he walked away, the bell above the door jingled faintly behind him. A sound he knew he would never hear again. Sam left Cedar Hill before dawn. The highway stretched ahead, endless and gray, the radio silent. He didn't look back. Some people say closure comes from confronting the past, but Sam understood that sometimes closure meant walking away from it completely. He drove for hours, stopping only when the fatigue blurred the lines on the road. Somewhere between Dallas and Baton Rouge, he found a small roadside motel and checked in under a name he hadn't used in years. Samuel Carter, his mother's maiden name. It felt strange, yet freeing, like shedding the last piece of a life that no longer fit. In that dim, quiet room, he unpacked only what he needed. His Bible, a photo of his late father, and the card Vivian had sent him in the hospital. You'll understand someday. He placed it on the table, stared at it for a long time, and then slid it into the drawer. He didn't know where he was going next. But for the first time in a long time he didn't need to. The road ahead was empty, yes, but it was his. Outside, the wind whispered through the open window, carrying with it the faint hum of truck engines and faraway voices. Sam lay back, hands folded on his chest, staring at the ceiling. There were no tears, no anger, just a quiet kind of resolve settling in his bones. He was walking alone now. But for a man who had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and death's doorstep, solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a second chance. The building sat just past the railroad crossing, half hidden behind a row of abandoned warehouses. Its faded red bricks bore the stains of rain and time, and the sign above the entrance, Lewis & Sons Auto Repair, was missing half its letters. Freight trains rumbled past every hour, rattling the thin windows and shaking loose flakes of paint from the ceiling. But to Sam Thornton it was more than a garage. It was sanctuary. After months of drifting, he had found himself in Fort Worth, standing before this forgotten shop owned by Frank Lewis, an old friend from his early mechanic days. Frank was slowing down, his hands no longer steady, but his heart was the same, quiet, generous, and unassuming. He offered Sam the small room behind the shop, a simple space with a bed, a desk, and a narrow window that overlooked the tracks. The rent was next to nothing, and the work was steady enough to keep his mind busy and his stomach full. Days slipped into weeks, marked by the rhythm of engines and the steady clatter of tools. Sam's world shrank down to the hum of oil compressors and the smell of steel. He fixed lawnmowers, motorcycles, and the occasional old truck that the neighborhood couldn't afford to junk. Every repair was a conversation between man and machine, a quiet exchange of trust, precision, and patience. Darius was the only person who kept showing up. He drove down from Cedar Hill every weekend, bringing boxes of parts, leftover food from his wife's kitchen, and stories about how the shop back home was doing under new ownership. He never pushed Sam to talk about the past. He just stayed, helped, and listened. In those long afternoons, surrounded by grease and the echo of the trains, something in Sam began to mend. Not the way a wound heals, but the way metal reforges under heat and pressure. He was no longer the man who had waited by hospital windows or stared at packed boxes. He was something different now. Together, he and Darius started tinkering with small ventures. It began as a way to pass time but slowly turned into purpose. They salvaged broken vending machines from junkyards, cleaned the parts and rebuilt them to resell. When that worked, they moved on to small cars. Old Hondas, Fords, Chevys bought cheap from auctions. Sam's hands moved with the precision of experience, his eyes sharp again. Every success, however small, carried the quiet satisfaction of survival. No applause, no audience, just the hum of an engine coming back to life. Some nights, when the trains passed, Sam would sit outside behind the shop, watching the long line of freight cars disappear into the horizon. The stars above Fort Worth looked different than those over Cedar Hill. Here they felt closer, like they were trying to remind him of something he'd forgotten. He thought of Vivian sometimes, but not with anger anymore. The hurt had dulled into something almost tender, a scar rather than an open wound. He wondered if she ever thought of him when the music faded and the guests went home. He doubted it. But he also realized he didn't need her memory to define him anymore. The room behind the shop became his world, a place of quiet rebirth. He cooked simple meals, kept his Bible by the bed, and wrote down every idea that came to him in a small notebook. Used parts. Mobile repair vans. Trade school for underprivileged kids. The ideas piled up faster than the money, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years he was building again, not out of love or obligation but out of choice. Frank watched from the sidelines with quiet admiration. He saw in Sam what every working man hopes for at the end of a storm. Not revenge, not triumph, just peace. By the end of that year, Sam and Darius had turned their tinkering into a small side business. Word spread slowly around Fort Worth about the man who could bring anything mechanical back to life. Cars that other shops refused to touch somehow purred again under Sam's hands. The locals started calling him Old Ironheart. The name stuck. And in a way it fit. His heart, repaired by mercy and tempered by betrayal, was stronger than it had ever been. As winter settled in, Sam stood one evening outside the shop, watching the trains pass under a violet sky. The hum of the tracks echoed through the air, a reminder of all the miles behind him and the roads yet to come. He didn't know where his next chapter would lead, but he felt something stir inside him. An ember of hope, small but steady. The quiet man of Cedar Hill was gone. The man standing here was something new. Fort Worth grew around Sam like a second chance. The world beyond the train tracks never noticed the small garage tucked behind the warehouses, and that was exactly how he liked it. There was peace in being unseen, freedom in being forgotten. While others chased spotlight and applause, Sam chased understanding, the quiet kind that comes from failing, learning, and trying again. At first, his days still belonged to grease and steel. Engines, vending machines, broken parts, anything that could be fixed or sold. But when the shop closed and the trains howled in the distance, Sam's nights belonged to something else entirely. He sat at his small desk under the weak light of a flickering bulb, flipping through real estate guides, studying tax maps, learning words like foreclosure, liens, and equity. It wasn't glamorous. It was lonely, heavy work. But for Sam, knowledge had always been the one thing no one could take from him. The idea had sparked one evening when a local man came by to sell his rusted pickup. Sam noticed the man's hesitation, the way he glanced toward the rundown house across the street. Its windows boarded, its yard wild with weeds. "They'll tear it down soon," the man said. "Ain't worth saving." But Sam had looked at that house differently. Beneath the neglect, he saw something familiar, a foundation strong enough to endure just like his own. It started small. He scraped together his savings from the garage, borrowed a little from Frank, and bought that first abandoned property. The roof sagged, the walls were cracked, but Sam didn't see decay, he saw promise. Every nail he drove in, every coat of paint he brushed on was an act of resurrection, not just for the building but for himself. Darius became his right hand. The young man handled the logistics, calls, permits, materials, while Sam oversaw the work with a calm precision that inspired respect. Together they worked through Texas heat and bitter winters, building something few understood and even fewer believed in. One house turned into two, then three. Each sale brought a little more profit, each risk taught a lesson. Sam read everything he could get his hands on. Books on property management, zoning laws, and renovation strategies. The man who once fixed engines by instinct now studied markets with surgical focus. He wasn't chasing wealth for vanity. He was building a fortress, not of walls but of independence. Years slipped by quietly. His hands grew rougher, his beard grayer, but his eyes sharper. Fort Worth began to change around him. Neighborhoods once forgotten started to bloom again. What others saw as decay, Sam had turned into renewal. His name spread quietly among real estate circles, whispered with the kind of respect reserved for men who play the long game. Still, he lived modestly. He didn't move into a mansion or drive a new car. His small room behind the garage remained his home. The Bible still lay by his bed, its pages worn at the edges. He rose before dawn, prayed in silence, and worked until the light faded. Darius often teased that Sam's secret wasn't business, it was patience. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something deeper. The unshakable discipline of a man who had already lost everything and knew how to start again. There were setbacks, of course. Tenants who skipped rent, roofs that collapsed mid-renovation, deals that went sour. But every failure became another brick in the foundation of his eventual success. The quiet man who had once been left to die now owned multiple properties across Fort Worth and the outskirts of Dallas. And yet, there was no pride in him, only gratitude. Each property, each dollar felt like a prayer answered slowly. He never forgot the hospital, the charity ward, the people who saved him when love turned its back. He never forgot the empty house in Cedar Hill or the letter that said, space. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit outside behind the garage, the trains rumbling in the distance, and think about how time had flipped the script of his life. He no longer wondered where Vivian was or whether she ever regretted her choice. He understood now, she had made her decision and he had made peace with it. Sam's story was no longer about survival. It was about restoration. Not just of buildings but of dignity. By the time the decade turned, Sam Thornton was no longer the man fixing engines behind the tracks. He was a quiet legend, a man who turned scraps into success, who built wealth not from greed but from grace. His heart, once betrayed, had found a new rhythm, steady, unbreakable, and his alone. The years moved like the steady tick of an old clock, deliberate, unhurried, unstoppable. For most men, success comes with noise. Applause, recognition, the weight of attention. For Sam Thornton it came in silence. He had built an empire brick by brick, deal by deal, without the world ever realizing it. What began as one repaired house grew into a string of properties across Fort Worth, Arlington, and the southern edges of Dallas County. Then came the trucks, old freight vehicles he bought cheap, restored, and leased out to small companies desperate for affordable transport. What started as survival had turned into strategy. By the time his name appeared in small corners of local business journals, Sam was already years ahead of anyone trying to understand him. His portfolio was layered, part real estate, part logistics, part storage. Nothing flashy. Nothing reckless. Just clean, disciplined growth. In the mornings he still woke before dawn, the same way he had in his Cedar Hill days. He brewed his coffee in the same dented pot, sat by the same window in his modest home, and looked out over a horizon that now belonged to him. Fort Worth's skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how far he'd chosen not to fall again. He never bought a mansion. Never remarried. Never sought out the kind of life that required applause. His wealth was quiet, tucked into trust accounts, investments, and land deeds that no one but Darius knew about. To outsiders he was just another man who ran a few businesses and kept to himself. But those who looked closer, the bankers, the contractors, the people who'd seen his steady hand, knew they were dealing with something rarer than success. They were dealing with self-mastery. Sam ran his companies with the precision of an engineer and the restraint of a monk. Every decision was measured against one unspoken rule: never again depend on anyone who could choose to walk away. His loyalty belonged only to hard work, time, and quiet faith. He employed dozens of workers, men and women from the same neighborhoods he once drove past with nothing but change in his pocket. He paid them fairly, trained them thoroughly, and expected nothing less than integrity. In return, they gave him loyalty that couldn't be bought. Some called him Mr. Thornton, others Old Iron Heart, a nickname that stuck and spread through the trucking yards and workshops like folklore. His evenings were solitary but peaceful. He'd walk through the warehouses as the sun dipped low, watching forklifts crawl between loading bays, the echo of steel doors closing for the night. The smell of diesel, the low hum of engines, the rhythm of work. These were the sounds of a life rebuilt, not through luck, but through discipline. Sometimes, when he drove home along the interstate, he'd pass by the bright lights of wedding venues, the music spilling out into the night. He would glance briefly, not in bitterness but in quiet reflection. Somewhere in that noise years ago he had been forgotten. But here, in the calm hum of progress, he had found himself again. Darius remained his closest ally, loyal, grounded, steady. Together they expanded the business, buying small trucking depots, investing in warehouse logistics, even dabbling in local manufacturing. Each move was deliberate, rooted in experience, never greed. Sam often said nothing at meetings, just listened, his eyes distant but sharp, seeing patterns others missed. He didn't need validation. His satisfaction came in the numbers that grew on spreadsheets, the steady hum of trucks carrying his name across state lines, the quiet gratitude of the men whose paychecks came from his decisions. He had learned something that most never would. The greatest victories make the least noise. By his early 60s, Sam Thornton was a man of quiet power. The same hands that once trembled from illness now signed contracts worth millions. The man who had once lain in a charity hospital bed now funded one anonymously, paying forward the mercy that had saved him. But even with all he had gained, he never forgot what it cost. Every dollar earned carried the echo of betrayal. Every business venture was built on the bones of an old promise broken. Yet instead of turning bitter, he turned wise. The pain that once consumed him had become the fuel that sustained him. There were nights, though, quiet ones, when the city slept and the world felt too still, when Sam would sit alone in his study, staring at the ledger books and wondering what it all meant. Success without companionship was its own kind of loneliness. But it was a loneliness he had chosen, clean, earned, and safe. And so he rose silently. Not as a man who wanted revenge, but as one who understood that peace and power could share the same table, as long as pride never took the seat. The quiet man of Cedar Hill had become the invisible architect of an empire. And though the world didn't know his story, the heavens surely did. The world they built on borrowed beauty began to crack, not suddenly but with the soft, relentless sound of truth whispering through the walls. 4 years Vivian Thornton had lived behind glass, polished, admired, untouchable. Her home shimmered with curated perfection, her laughter rehearsed, her faith convenient. In her circle, appearances were everything, reality was decoration. But beneath that perfection, rot had been spreading quietly. It began with Avery. The man who had once worn his father's collar like a badge of purity had become restless. Success came too easily. Temptation too often. He liked the sound of admiration, the thrill of being needed, by other women, by attention, by the world. At first, Vivian pretended not to notice. She told herself he was busy, that every great man carried secrets. But lies have a way of echoing in empty rooms. When the affair became undeniable, the fairy tale cracked wide open. Whispers followed her to church, to the grocery store, to charity events where she used to shine. The same women who once complimented her shoes now shared glances of pity, or worse, satisfaction. The pastor's son had done what no one dared believe. He abandoned his perfect bride. The divorce papers came quietly, hand-delivered by a man who couldn't meet her eyes. Within weeks, Avery had moved on, younger woman, newer life, and no backward glance. The world that once worshipped them as the golden couple now treated their love story like old news. Vivian's phone stopped ringing. The invitations dried up. Even the church that had once praised her devotion turned cold, polite, distant. Her donations no longer mattered without his influence. She tried to keep up appearances, the makeup, the smile, the poise, but the cracks were too deep. Credit cards maxed out. The house slipped into foreclosure. The friends she called sisters found reasons not to answer. And one morning, as movers carried out the last of her furniture, Vivian finally saw herself, not the woman she'd pretended to be, but the one she'd become, empty, fragile, and forgotten. Across town, Avery's new life gleamed for a while before its shine faded too. His charm thinned under the weight of his own ego. The church he once helped lead distanced itself after a scandal. Money, women, lies. He'd become what his father once warned him about, a man who preached what he never practiced. And just like that, the house of cards collapsed. Vivian found herself in a small apartment. White walls, thin carpet, no garden to tend. The silence was sharp. She tried calling Avery, tried calling old friends, even the church. No one came. The world she had traded love for was gone. For the first time in her life, Vivian understood what it meant to be without. Without money. Without protection. Without the man who used to call her, my queen. At night, she would sit by the window watching headlights pass, each one carrying a stranger who didn't know her name. She thought about Sam then, the man she'd pushed aside for status, the man who had once looked at her like she was the only light left in his world. Regret crept in slowly but deeply. She replayed that morning, the packed boxes, the quiet goodbye she never allowed him to give. She remembered the look in his eyes, not anger, not even pain, but something worse, disbelief. That a love so real could be so easily erased. Now she understood. The fairy tale hadn't ended because fate was cruel. It had ended because it was never built on truth. And when truth finally came knocking, it took everything false with it. Vivian sat alone in that empty apartment, the echo of her past heavy in the air. Somewhere far away she imagined Sam, alive, steady, maybe even thriving. The thought stung, but it also warmed her in ways she didn't understand. For the first time in years she whispered a prayer. Not for wealth, not for restoration, but for peace. And maybe for forgiveness. Sometimes the life that looks perfect is the one most hollow inside. Have you ever watched someone lose everything they once worshipped, and only then see what truly mattered? Where are you watching from tonight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone out there might need your reminder that not every loss is punishment. Some are mercy in disguise. The name appeared quietly, not on the news, not in gossip, but in a Sunday lifestyle magazine left on a waiting room chair. Vivian almost didn't notice it. She was there for a small interview, hoping for a clerical job at a local bank. But when her eyes drifted across the glossy page, something made her stop. Sam Thornton. The headline read, "The Quiet Visionary Behind South Dallas Revival." Her heart stuttered. The photo was small, black and white. A man in a dark tailored suit standing beside a row of newly built houses. The lines of his face were familiar, though age had deepened them. His posture was calm, confident. His smile, reserved, dignified, carried no trace of the man she once left trembling in a hospital bed. For a long time Vivian just stared. Her fingers trembled as she traced the image, her chest tightening. So, the man she had written off as broken had rebuilt himself into something the world now admired. When she brought the magazine home, Avery was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone, lost in her own bitterness. The moment she saw the photo, her face drained of color. "Mama," she whispered, voice cracking, "that's him, that's Sam." Vivian didn't speak. She couldn't. The memory of that name carried too much weight, too many ghosts. In the years that followed his disappearance, she had told herself that Sam was probably fine. Maybe remarried. Maybe moved away. She'd buried the guilt under routines, excuses, and selective memory. But now, staring at the article, she saw the truth written in print. The truth that he hadn't just survived, he had risen. The story described how a quiet investor had poured millions into rebuilding forgotten neighborhoods. How his investments had created jobs for single mothers, rebuilt playgrounds, and restored dignity to communities once left behind. It wasn't charity. It was legacy. And suddenly Vivian understood, this wasn't luck or fate. This was purpose. The man she'd abandoned when he was worth nothing had become a man whose worth couldn't be measured in money. Avery read aloud from the article, her voice trembling. "He prefers not to talk about his past," she read softly. "But he believes in second chances. For people, for places, for dreams that others gave up on." The words sank like stones. Vivian rose from the chair and walked to the window. The city lights blurred behind a thin film of tears. For years she'd chased wealth, attention, reputation, all of which had vanished like smoke. But here was Sam, a man who once asked only for love, standing tall without any of the things she thought made life worth living. Avery came up beside her, voice small, almost childlike. "Mama, do you think he hates us?" Vivian closed her eyes. "No," she whispered, her throat tight. "I think he doesn't remember us at all." But deep down she knew that wasn't true. Sam remembered everything, every silence, every betrayal, every unanswered call that never came. That night neither of them spoke much. The magazine stayed open on the kitchen table, its edges curling from where Vivian's hands had clutched it too tightly. The photo of Sam seemed to watch them, not with malice, not even with anger, but with something colder, indifference. It was that indifference that broke her most. The next morning, Vivian dressed with quiet determination. She didn't know what she wanted, forgiveness, closure, or maybe just a glimpse of the life she'd thrown away. But she knew one thing, she had to see him. To look into the eyes of the man she once chose not to save. Outside, the sun was rising over Dallas, a city Sam had rebuilt piece by piece, while she and Avery watched their world crumble in silence. And for the first time in years, Vivian felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Not pride, not vanity, but humility. A painful kind of grace that only comes after everything else has been stripped away. The man the world now admired was the same one she had once left to die. and she was finally ready to face what that meant. The road to Cedar Hill felt longer than it once was. Time had stretched it, miles of memory and regret winding through fields that seemed to whisper everything they'd forgotten. The trees, taller now, swayed under the same southern wind that once carried Sam's laughter. But now even the breeze felt different, quieter, older, more knowing. Vivian gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. Beside her, Avery sat in silence, her young son asleep in the back seat. His soft breathing filled the car like a metronome of innocence, a sound untouched by history. It had been almost 15 years since they'd seen him. 15 years since Vivian stood in that empty living room with boxes packed and a heart hardened by pride. Now, her hands trembled at the thought of facing the man she'd once deemed unworthy of sacrifice. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Mama?" Avery finally asked, eyes fixed on the long stretch of road ahead. Vivian didn't answer right away. She glanced out at the passing landscape, familiar roads now lined with new homes, community centers, and playgrounds. Signs read Thornton Development Group. She swallowed hard. Every one of those letters carried his name, and his forgiveness perhaps for everyone but her. "I just need to see him," she murmured. "That's all." The GPS voice broke the silence. "Turn left onto Thornton Way." They both froze for a moment. The name, his name, displayed boldly on the sign made Avery's chest tighten. When they turned, the road widened into a long driveway framed by oak trees and white fences. Beyond it stood a sprawling estate, elegant yet understated, surrounded by acres of open land that breathed peace. The house wasn't loud with wealth. It was calm. Oh, a reflection of the man who had rebuilt himself not for applause, but for purpose. Vivian parked near the gate. The metal bars gleamed in the afternoon sun, engraved with the initials ST. Her reflection in the gate's smooth surface startled her. She saw a woman aged not only by years but by guilt. The lines around her mouth were deeper, her eyes duller, her beauty faded not by time alone, but by choices she'd once made so easily. Avery stepped out first, holding her son close. She looked up at the house, then back at her mother. "He really did it," she whispered. "He really built something good." Vivian nodded faintly. "He always tried to." For a long moment, neither moved. The estate was quiet, the kind of quiet that commands respect. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime sang, soft and haunting. Vivian took a deep breath and walked toward the intercom by the gate. Her hand hovered over the button. How do you speak to the man you abandoned when he needed you most? How do you explain that the very thing you chased, wealth, prestige, status, had become meaningless the moment he stopped chasing you back? She pressed the button. The speaker crackled. A male voice, deep, composed, answered, "Thornton Residence." Vivian froze. Even through the static she knew that voice. The tone was the same, steady, warm beneath the surface, though now it carried something else too, power. Hello, she managed, her voice breaking slightly. "This is Vivian. Vivian Thornton." There was a pause. A long one. So long that she thought the line had gone dead. Then, "Mrs. Thornton," he said at last, his words measured. "What can I do for you?" She swallowed hard, glancing at Avery. I just wanted to see you. To talk." Another silence followed, colder this time. Then the gate clicked. It opened slowly with the heavy groan of iron and memory. Vivian's heart pounded. They walked the long path toward the house. Each step felt like penance. The sound of gravel beneath her heels echoed in her ears like a clock ticking down to judgment. At the front door, a man in his 60s stood waiting. Sam Thornton. He was older, yes. Gray now streaked his beard and the lines on his face had deepened. But there was no mistaking him. His eyes were sharp, calm, and unreadable. Time had carved dignity into his posture. Wealth hadn't changed him. It had only refined what was already there. Vivian's breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but words failed her. Sam looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then at Avery, then at the child in her arms. "Sam," she whispered. "It's been so long." "Yes," he said simply. "It has." The wind moved gently between them. The sound of the chime returned, faint and lingering, like the past refusing to fade completely. Vivian felt her throat tighten. "You look, well." "I am," he said, his voice steady. "Better than I was." Avery stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, I'm sorry. For everything." Her voice trembled, but it carried sincerity, the kind that comes too late but still matters. Sam's eyes softened briefly as he glanced at the child in her arms. "You have a son," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, then looked back at Vivian. You came all this way. Why? Vivian's lips parted, but no words came. Because she didn't know. Because forgiveness felt too big to ask for and too small to deserve. I just wanted to see you, she said at last, voice breaking. To know you're okay. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back slowly, his hand resting on the doorknob. His gaze lingered on her face, not with hatred, but with the calm detachment of a man who no longer owed the past anything. Then gently, without a word, he closed the door. The sound echoed. A soft click that felt louder than thunder. Vivian stood there for a long time, staring at the wood between them, the wind brushing through her hair. Avery said nothing. Neither did the child. And as the sun began to dip behind the house, Vivian whispered the words she should have said years ago, to no one but the empty air. I'm sorry, Sam. But the door stayed shut. The sound came softly, 1, 2, 3 knocks, each one trembling through the still morning air. Sam heard it before he saw them. He stood by the window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the sunlight crawl slowly across the quiet fields of Cedar Hill. The air was peaceful, the kind of peace he'd built with sweat, solitude, and silence. He didn't rush to the door. Some knocks you don't run toward. When he finally opened it, time seemed to slow. Vivian stood there, smaller somehow, her posture no longer poised but fragile. The years had reshaped her. Her hair was streaked with gray, her beauty tempered by humility. Behind her stood Avery, holding her little boy close, her eyes red from tears that hadn't yet dried. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sam's gaze moved from Vivian to Avery, then to the child. The boy looked up at him curiously, too young to know the weight of what was happening. The innocence in his eyes almost hurt. Vivian's lips parted. Her voice came out thin, shaking, the sound of someone trying to hold on to dignity that no longer fit. Sam, she whispered. It was the first time she had said his name in 12 years. He didn't answer. She took a small step forward, her hands trembling. I came to say I'm sorry. For everything. For the choices I made. For leaving you when you needed me most. I thought I was doing what was right, what was smart. But life, she swallowed hard. Life punished me for that, Sam. I lost everything. I lost myself. Sam's expression didn't change. His eyes were calm, not cold, not angry, just still. Avery stepped forward next, her voice breaking. Mr. Thornton, I was young. I didn't understand what she did. I just followed her. But I know now. You didn't deserve what happened to you. You were a good man. The child stirred, his small fingers clutching his mother's shoulder as she spoke. The sight almost made Sam look away, not because of pain, but because of the deep, quiet understanding that time had already delivered its own justice. Vivian's tears began to fall. Please, she whispered. Just tell me you understand. You don't have to forgive me. Just, let me know you see how sorry I am. Sam set his cup down gently on the small table by the door. The breeze moved through the open frame, carrying with it the faint scent of rain coming from the distance. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time since the day she left him. And then, in that soft, unshakable tone of his, he said, I begged for my life once. You said there were better things to spend on. So now. He paused, eyes steady. I'm just doing what you taught me. The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy, cutting through years of regret with surgical precision. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Avery's tears fell freely. The little boy looked up, confused by the silence of adults breaking beneath memories he could never understand. Sam gave one last look, not cruel, not triumphant, just final. Then, calm as the wind before rain, he closed the door. The latch clicked softly, the sound of closure, the end of a storm that had waited 12 long years to pass. Outside, Vivian stood frozen, her hand still raised as if the door might open again. It didn't. The world around her was quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint echo of everything she'd lost. Avery turned away first, whispering something to her son. Vivian stayed a moment longer, her tears falling to the gravel at her feet, each drop like an unanswered prayer. Then she whispered to herself, barely audible, I taught him too well. And with that she walked away. The house was still. After the door closed, the sound of it lingered like the final note of a song, soft, final, and full of everything that could never be said. Sam stood there for a long time, one hand still resting on the doorframe, his eyes fixed on the wood grain as though memory itself was carved there. Outside, he could hear faint murmurs, a woman's muffled sob, the shuffle of feet on gravel, a child's soft cry. Then the silence deepened. Their footsteps grew distant, until there was nothing left but the hum of wind brushing past the eaves of the house. He turned slowly, walking back into the living room. The afternoon light spilled through the wide windows, golden and calm, resting across the furniture he'd chosen piece by piece. Everything in this house carried his mark, not of wealth but of work. The smell of cedar and motor oil still clung faintly to his hands, a reminder that no matter how far he'd risen, he'd built it all with the same grit that once turned wrenches in a dusty shop. He sat down in his favorite chair, the one by the old brick fireplace. From there he could see everything, the framed photos, the books, the quiet evidence of a life rebuilt. But today his eyes lingered not on the present, but on the ghost that had come to visit through memory's door. He could see Vivian laughing, her head thrown back in the early years before status hardened her heart. He could see Avery as a little girl, tugging on his sleeve in the garage, asking to help him hand over tools. He could even see himself, younger, idealistic, believing that love could survive anything. The laughter, the warmth, the promises, they flickered like an old film, edges frayed, light fading. Then came the darker scenes, the night in the hospital, the unanswered phone, the wedding photos he saw from a hospital bed. He felt them all pass through him again, not as wounds now but as echoes, faint, powerless. He closed his eyes. For years he had carried anger like a second skin. It had driven him, molded him, built his empire brick by brick. But now, sitting in that quiet room with the wind whispering outside, he felt something else, peace. Not the easy kind that forgets, but the heavy kind that forgives without words. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't always mean letting someone back in. Sometimes it just meant setting down the weight and walking forward lighter. He took a deep breath, steady and slow. The kind of breath a man takes when he's finally free, not from others but from himself. Outside, through the window, he could see the long stretch of his land, green, open, alive. The same place that once held his pain now held his peace. Vivian and Avery were gone. He knew they wouldn't come back, and he didn't wish them harm. In some small, quiet way, he even hoped they'd find their own kind of peace, somewhere far from the shadow of what they'd done. As dusk began to settle, Sam leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. The house hummed softly, the ticking of a clock, the rustle of curtains, the faint scent of rain drifting in through a half-open window. He smiled faintly. The past was still there, but it no longer ruled him. It was just an echo now, fading with every heartbeat. And for the first time in years, Sam Thornton felt whole. The morning air in Cedar Hill carried the scent of rain, fresh, forgiving, and full of beginnings. Sam stepped out of his car and stood for a moment in the church parking lot. It looked smaller than he remembered. The same white wooden steeple, a little worn with time. The same oak tree standing beside the steps, leaves whispering softly in the breeze. This was the place where everything began, and where, in a different lifetime, everything had fallen apart. He walked slowly toward the doors, each step measured, unhurried. Inside, the soft murmur of children's voices echoed from the newly rebuilt youth center. The laughter was bright, full of the kind of innocence the world tries so hard to take away. He paused by the doorway, unseen. Darius stood beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes filled with quiet respect. He knew the story without needing to ask. Some things are written not in words, but in the way a man carries his silence. Sam reached into his jacket pocket, holding the folded donation slip, a gift large enough to rebuild the youth center twice over. But his name wasn't on it. No one would ever know where it came from. That was the point. He nodded toward Darius. Make sure it reaches them. Quietly. Darius smiled. You got it, boss. Sam turned to leave, but before he reached the door, a voice called out. Brother Thornton? The pastor, older now with grayer hair but the same kind eyes, walked toward him, hand extended. Sam stopped, returning the handshake. It's been a long time, he said softly. Too long, the pastor replied with a warm smile. You've done more for this place than you know. Sam's eyes wandered around the sanctuary, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the pews. For a moment, he saw flashes of the past, Avery in her wedding gown, Vivian's proud smile, the man he once was, standing in that same light, unaware of how life would break and remake him. He drew a deep breath. Sometimes, he said quietly, you have to lose everything, to remember what's worth keeping. The pastor nodded slowly. And sometimes the ones who lose the most are the ones who find the deepest peace. Sam smiled faintly. Then he turned toward the open doors. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, bathing the church in golden light. It felt like the same sun that had watched him through his heartbreak, only now it warmed instead of burned. He stepped out onto the church steps, pausing just long enough to glance back once more. The heavy oak doors closed softly behind him, sealing the past inside, not out of bitterness but closure. For the first time in years his heart felt light. The same man who once walked away in pain now walked forward in peace. The door behind him was closed, but his heart, finally, was open again. Sometimes closure isn't about revenge or apology, it's about walking away lighter, knowing you've already healed. Have you ever found peace in something you once thought broke you? Tell us where you're watching from tonight, and what door you had to close before your heart could truly open again.